Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. Today I'm joined by my co-founder George Szamuely and Helen Buyniski. Helen is a journalist for RT, and you can find her writings at helenofdestroy.com. I'll put a link in our description and you can follow that later. So we are gathered here today in awe to discuss the possibility of post-Trump America and post-Trump politics. There's been a lot of firsts this year. I think that there's been a lot of unexpected twists and turns in the way that American politics has gone, and what is the lasting impact or the lasting legacy of Trump if he's not re-elected. I'll go to you, Helen, first with your initial thoughts on the topic.
Well, it's going to be very difficult for the Democrats to chill out their raging mobs because everybody is so worked up, really on both sides. So, I mean, the lasting legacy of Trump on the right is that everybody's going to be completely, like, they're not going to know which way is up if Trump goes away. For one thing, the media is not going to know what to do because they've been so busy covering every little move that Trump makes for the last 4 years that they're going to have to find something else to occupy their time, because who else is going to be tweeting every 5 minutes and insulting people? But more the people, they're really going to have to completely reframe their expectations as far as, I mean, I do think that the Democrats don't necessarily want this job because it's pretty clear we're facing an economic collapse and they don't want to be left holding the bag. But it also seems that Trump doesn't want this job anymore because he doesn't want to be left holding the bag. So in the event that Trump gets his wish and is out of there, then, I mean, we're going to be facing an economic collapse, and it will just be a slightly different kind of economic collapse. I don't think that the raging mobs will be put down so easily by having their guy, another neoliberal centrist in the White House. Like, I don't think that it's going to be so calm. I mean, a lot of people seem to believe that, oh, well, once Trump is out, all the riots are going to calm down and everything is going to go back to normal. And no, and not quite. I mean, you've worked up a raging mob the size and intensity of which they have, like, something has to give. And people are still broke. People are still desperate. The Democrats are not going to make all these grand social programs that they're kind of sort of hinting at that they're making. But notice there's been no, like, concrete policy promises on that. So, I mean, it's really such a pathetic sham of a political system at this point. I mean, the debates last night, oh. But I mean, it's like the two most loathsome people you can find at each other's throats, like trying to be polite about it, but no.
The starring appearance of the Fly in that debate.
Yeah, like if either party adopted the Fly as their vice presidential candidate, they would actually do better.
George, if you'd like to comment pick up on what Helen has said, which I think is very important, is that, you know, that you have a guy who's running as not being Trump, and then you have Trump himself. But what's the substance in all of that? You don't have any real substance behind either candidate. And if either one were to achieve a second term, nobody knows what a second term would look like. And what would your thoughts be on the landscape that may lie after Trump?
Well, I think you have to look at two things, which is what happens domestically and what happens with foreign policy. I think when it comes to foreign policy, it's easier to predict because the people who will arrive in power will be the so-called humanitarian interventionists, the foreign policy activist crowds, the people who want to return America to global leadership. And I think that all of those people, like Susan Rice will be back, Samantha Power will be back, Antony Blinken will be back, Jake Sullivan will be back. All of those people will be there, and they will be hungry to get involved in all kinds of interventionist wars. Syria, they will without question renew the war in Syria to try to oust the government of Bashar al-Assad. I think that they will get themselves involved in the civil war in Libya. Trump has actually quite adroitly avoided getting too involved in Libya. I think that Belarus, I think they're going to make trouble in Belarus. I think they'll will probably get involved in Nagorno-Karabakh. So these are all areas that Trump has actually quite adroitly avoided. And I think there's crisis now going on in Kyrgyzstan, and I can see Biden, it's hard to tell, but Biden wading in to Kyrgyzstan. In other words, these are people who haven't seen any kind of a crisis that they don't want America to get involved in. So I think that will, without question, be the agenda of the foreign policy agenda of the Biden team.
Yeah. And in terms of domestic policy, then, you think?
Well, in terms of domestic policy, I think I agree with Helen. I think that they are going to have difficulties keeping the raging mob under control. These are people who quite enjoy rioting and looting. I mean, there's a famous book written in the 1960s by Edward Banfield, a social scientist, about riots. And he said, why do people riot? Well, they do it for fun and for profit. Rioting is fun. I mean, looting stores is fun. Violence is fun. Some people really enjoy it. I mean, not the victims of it, but those who are the perpetrators of it. So it's going to be quite hard to just bring that to an end. Mm-hmm. And the police aren't going to be very happy bringing it to an end, because they don't want to find themselves before grand juries on murder charges. So they'll be very reluctant to get themselves involved in any kind of melees with rioters. I think that will be. I think there'll also be some kind of a reckoning with the Trump supporters and Trump himself. Yeah. They're going to use the Justice Department, the federal Justice Department, but also all the state courts as well, to try to make life as miserable as possible for Trump, his family, his supporters. So I think that there's going to be a kind of a bloodbath, maybe a literal one and a metaphorical one.
Well, if you look at historically if we take the past century and you look at the legacy of single-term presidents, in the last century, there's only been 3 that I could find, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Herbert Hoover, Jimmy Carter, and George H.W. Bush. So over the span of 100 years, you only have 3 presidents who've not been re-elected. So it's quite an anomaly within itself. And if you look at the circumstances within their whole debate systems and their whole ousting, you have, if you take away third-party challenges, you're just left with Hoover and Carter as 2 solid examples. And if you look at the circumstances surrounding their failures, then you see that both failed to handle significant national disasters. Economically, both of them were in a very difficult position, which again was a difficult position to get out of, which I think is true, as Helen, you were saying. Whoever inherits this presidency will be dealing with a lot of instability and a mess economically. And the turning points in the presidential cycles, with the profound shifts in political order, for the first was from Republican to Democrats, and then we saw the Democrat to Republican shift, and we're also now at this breaking point with a shift. Do you have any projections upon this whole shift in order? It will be continuing the Democratic cycle if Joe Biden is re-elected, but at the same time, Biden is not your traditional Democrat. Like, if anything, I would define him as a liberal Republican.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you make that reference to Hoover and Carter, because they, like you said, they both had these giant depressions that they were dealing with, and serious collapse-like situations. So, I mean, I think that the fact that there have been so many of these 2-term presidencies really underscores that most Americans just vote lesser of 2 evils, because you're literally voting more out of fear of, okay, well, this guy's bad, but this guy's actually worse, so we're going to hold on to our bad guy, the devil we know, versus the devil we don't know. Yeah. And I do think that it's possible that that might carry Trump to a second term, but it's looking less and less likely. I mean, I really think that he's throwing this election. But as far as the Democratic pattern, Biden, in any normal country, Biden would be seen as on the right. There's no, unfortunately, Clinton started this whole process of just pushing the Democrats to the right, and now we really don't have a left-wing party. I mean, if you look at the party leaders like Nancy Pelosi, and I mean, even Kamala Harris, like she's sort of tried to reinvent herself as this, oh, when I was Attorney General, I was a reformer. And it's like, no, actually you weren't. You literally suppressed evidence to keep people in jail and tried to block a court order that ordered you to relieve overcrowding in California jails, to release prisoners because you needed them to fight fires, because you wanted to save the state some money. So that's not a reformer. And there's this idea that Kamala Harris is this, oh, she's such a far left, whatever Trump has been calling her, it's just so out of left field, literally. But I mean, I see third parties as making some gains in this election, just because people are so disgusted with both of the main ones. But I mean, it's at this point, the Titanic is like 2/3 of the way sunk, and I don't think you can really, no matter how much polling power you ramp up, you can't really get it back up. And so it's just a question of how can we cushion the landing to make things less miserable for everybody in this country. And as you, George, mentioned, the foreign policy repercussions of a Biden administration are going to be completely horrible. And I mean, I didn't get to that in my first answer because I thought that you were speaking in terms of domestic, but we're going to continue to be overextended in the foreign sphere, even if we just maintain things at current levels. I mean, Trump, of course, campaigned on ending the wars, but didn't. He's removed some troops, which is a lot more than you would get from his opponent at the time. Of course, Hillary Clinton, who wanted to go to war in Iran and all of this. And I still think Biden will go to war in Iran. Although, given that we really can't afford any of this, I don't know how he plans to pay for that. But basically, the dollar is going to collapse, and that's going to seriously shake up the financial system. So, I mean, again, no matter who's at the helm, it's pretty much a question of not if, but when this system is going to collapse.
Yeah, and George, on that point of collapse and economic collapse, in terms of then having any kind of capital to put your money where your mouth is, I really don't see any major progressive political policy actually holding strong, because it will be a question of like tight budgets and where we can actually put money to just stabilize things to have a kind of okay level of normality in the States. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think that they want to do anything to harm their Wall Street friends. I mean, the Wall Street is raising far more money for Biden than it is for Trump. I mean, so the Democrats are far outpacing the Republicans when it comes to Wall Street, as happened in 2016. There's a reason for that. Wall Street obviously isn't going to throw money away for somebody who's going to come after them. They obviously don't think a Biden administration will come after them. And I think that it will be a return to the Obama era, which is shipping jobs overseas, deindustrialization, that means greater unemployment, and a kind of immiserization of the public, since those high-paying jobs will disappear and everyone will be back, flipping hamburgers or cleaning shoes or just catering to the wealthy tourist. One thing where they will, quote, do a progressive policy is, I think, on immigration. I think that, and there's a self-interest involved, which is open borders, amnesty for everyone who's in the United States illegally, is a way of boosting Democratic numbers. I mean, this is what the Democrats will want to do. They want to make sure that they will stay in power for the next few decades. How do you do that? Well, you basically you change the demography of the country. You make everyone here is illegally. It could be 30 million, 40 million, 50 million. No one really knows the actual number by definition. I mean, if they're not registered, they're not no one knows how many there are. So that will ensure the Democrats will be in power for quite a long time, and as other things as well, like statehood for D.C. and Puerto Rico. It's going to be very hard then for the Republicans to come back from that. So there, I think it's like, okay, that's progressive. But in terms of doing anything about the power of the corporations, in terms of doing anything about finance, capital, no, they're not going to touch that.
No. Okay, well, on that point, George, we're going to leave off with you. Thank you very much for joining us. Join myself and Helen for part 2, and we'll be joined by Peter for that. Thanks, guys, for watching, and we'll be back shortly.
Okay.